The Geforce 5090 might be the most difficult graphics card I've ever tested. The easiest way to picture its performance is to imagine a Geforce 4090 if its performance scaled linearly, great start, with increased power consumption. So while the 4090 would consume about 400 watts of power, the 5090 would often break 500, 550, 575 in my testing. But the frame rate increases would remain in line with how you'd expect a 4090 to perform should it be able to hit those power levels. But that's simplifying a very complicated situation. It's much better to break it down into categories, with the first one being raster performance. I know there are a lot of you who still don't believe in AI, upscaling, path tracing, stuff like that. So for you, I made sure I tested games without those newer graphical features. Games like Crysis 3, Assassin's Creed Mirage, Deus Ex Mankind Divided, Death Stranding, and Starfield. Here are the results, and I can confidently say that if you want to play games like this, then you do not need a 5090. You don't even need a 4090. Even that was handling these games fully maxed out at a native 4K resolution at least 90 FPS, and the 5090 manages them at 8K 60 FPS, maxed out and with no upscaling or frame gen trickery. It is ridiculously overkill, and yes, I'm going to use the word overkill because it is. It might even be future-proof. Unfortunately, these ridiculous frame rate stats also come with increased power draw. The 4090 is hardly a low-powered card, but given what it can do, I think its 350 to 400 watts of power consumption is very reasonable. In these raster-only tests, the Geforce 5090 managed 50% more performance with 40% extra power draw. So on paper it works out ever so slightly more power efficient than the 4090, but when you're talking triple-digit frame rates and almost 600 watts of power consumption, saying it's power efficient is somewhat arbitrary. So the RTX 5090 doesn't feel like a leap in efficiency to me. It just feels like it's what the 4090 always wanted to be if it had the cooling capacity to do so. My cat, Fluffykins, likes to sit on top of my PC when I'm gaming because it's nice and warm. When I was testing the 5090, she hopped up onto it and then almost immediately jumped back off again because it was too hot, even for a cat. The 5090 can clearly dissipate a lot of heat from itself, but that heat is then pushed into the rest of your PC, so you'll benefit from having a case with a lot of space, with a lot of fans, or with no sides on it at all. We in the PC space are all about more overclocking, more FPS, believing this to always be better, but testing the 5090, I felt the opposite to be true. What if we have enough already? If you had a PS2 emulator and it was consuming 500 watts of power, you'd be like, hang on a sec, something isn't right here. Same with the 5090 in rasterized games. It just doesn't need that much power to do that. So if you're not playing games with path tracing, then you don't need a 5090's full power. Just limit these games to whatever resolution and refresh rate your monitor supports and enjoy a rock-solid experience in these games with a fraction of the power consumption. My processor, the Intel i9-3900K, is not the fastest gaming processor in the world anymore. That would be the Ryzen 9800X 3D. It doesn't matter in practice, it's clear the 3900K offers more than enough gaming performance for any game ever. But as somebody benchmarking the 5090, it is not powerful enough. I'm not even sure the X3D processors would be fast enough. I actually happen to be one of the few people in the world who would benefit from more power. So in my testing, I ensured that it was 100% maxing out the graphics card at all times, and when I was in doubt, I boosted the resolution to 8K just in case. From my testing, I think the easiest mistake reviewers could make with this card is to underestimate it, and to overestimate their CPU's performance, especially if they have an X3D processor. And I believe that even with the Ryzen 9800X 3D, there will be certain games and situations where this graphics card will be processor limited, even at 4K. Hence why I play at 8K. The 4090 was already ridiculous, but now we're entering unexplored territory for GPU performance, and for GPU power consumption. I have a 1000 watt PSU, and I fear even that might not be enough for when the Geforce 5090 approaches 600 watts and when my 3900K decides to do something a bit funky in the benchmarks. So yeah, if you're not path tracing, you don't need this card. You don't need that card either. It's ridiculous. However, if you're interested in ray tracing, then this card does have certain use cases. This is actually where I saw the smallest boost over the 4090, with the 5090 averaging just 28% faster and drawing 36% more power on average. You can see the results somewhere over here for yourself. I'm not going to go through all these games individually one by one, but I would like to discuss the Cyberpunk results. For those of you who don't know, Cyberpunk 2077 is the game that Nvidia have chosen to add all of the latest new ray traced and DLSS features to. It's always one of the first, and so in a way, this game represents where Nvidia is headed with DLSS. So where are they headed with DLSS? You might think, what with the ray tracing preset and the path tracing and then the super demanding path traced overdrive mode and then the ray reconstruction feature, that they're focusing on boosting visual quality in that game. But then, with the various upscaling and frame generation features, you might also assume they're focusing on boosting frame rates. Both these observations are sort of correct. What they're really doing with Cyberpunk is to offer choice. And this, in a way, nicely represents what DLSS is about. It's about giving you choice. If the user of a PC is like, I favour high FPS, then the game will cater to that via various DLSS features. But another user might care more about getting the best graphics possible for taking screenshots or whatever, for which this game's graphics options can cater to as well. The problem with more choice is that some people always want everything, and then complain when they can't have it all, as though it's a failing of the choices, rather than because of the choices. So I'm not going to complain that Cyberpunk, and indeed DLSS, offers more choices, and some of them I might not want to use all of the time, because they're there if I want them, and I suspect they would make sense for some users in certain use cases. I'll start with the one that existing owners of RTX cards should be the most excited about, and that's the move from CNN to transformer models. I'm excited about this because it improves the visual quality of DLSS upscaling across the board, for all owners of existing RTX cards as well. These new ones are apparently more complicated to run, so might run with a little bit more slowdown, especially on older generations of RTX card, though I saw no slowdown whatsoever using them on my 4090. On that card at least, it seems like a no-brainer to switch to the new models for better image quality, essentially for free. Think of what this means for you. It means you could drop down from DLSS quality to DLSS performance, which itself will give you higher frame rates. However, the new transformer models should still be able to deliver a result that looks as good as, or possibly even better, than the old DLSS quality mode did. That is exciting. So no matter what your use case, if you don't like upscaling, then it means you can use DLAA for maximum image quality, and this update just means you'll get even more image quality from it. So wins across the board there. Meanwhile, at the other end of the spectrum, people such as myself will enjoy DLSS Ultra Performance Mode even more. This is the most extreme form of DLSS upscaling currently available, which makes 9 pixels from every one that's being sampled. So this setting was initially intended for use at super high resolutions like 8K, but I found use for it at 4K, and often found it good enough in games. And if it didn't look good enough, then I could always bump it up to DLSS performance mode and it would be. But in general, I found Ultra Performance to look good enough at 4K resolution, whilst delivering really high frame rates. And with the new Transformer models, they should look better than ever, so yeah, win for me as well. So in case I hadn't made it obvious, if DLSS upscaling is available in a game, then I'll enable it, no questions asked. Its benefits far outweigh the negatives. But DLSS 3's frame generation technology is a lot more complicated, namely the issue of latency. It is always displaying an image that's a few frames behind the present. Latency of some sort is inevitable. Dare I risk nuanced discussion on this topic? Is that even possible? To make it simple, we must weigh up the pros of more FPS against the cons of more latency, and this is not simple. Conventionally, more FPS delivers a smoother and more responsive experience. The two come hand in hand, so I never bothered to dissect it before now, but now that frame generation exists, I have to, because the two are no longer linked. And I believe the search for higher frame rates for me was always about the increased responsiveness first and foremost, with the visual smoothness coming second. I think I reached this conclusion by playing competitive shooters like Counter-Strike Source back in the day. For that genre, I still wouldn't enable frame generation out of principle, not even if I couldn't feel any latency while using it. Frame generation, by its very nature, deviates from the raw reflexive output that you want your PC to be in for competitive flick shooting based titles. But on the other end of the spectrum, with racing and exploration games, it looking smooth is probably more important than immediate responsiveness. Obviously both are nice, but I find frame generation beneficial even at low frame rates in these kinds of games. For when running in a straight line, performing slow-paced puzzles in the Talos Principle, or when driving a car in a racing game, the benefits of frame generation are plain to see. They make the world look smooth and fluid instead of just a stream of images. So frame generation should be off for flick shooters and on for racing, simulation and controller-based experiences. because controllers aren't responsive anyway, are they? But it's the games that sit in the awkward middle ground where frame generation's value is more debatable. I was really trying to figure out the cutoff point where mouse movements finally felt acceptable with frame generation activated. And for this I was testing Hogwarts Legacy and the Talos Principle 2. But even here, these two games felt different at the same frame rate. In Hogwarts, it felt responsive at like 60 FPS, whereas the Talos Principle 2 at 60 FPS still felt like weird stuff was going on with mouse inputs and stuff, even with frame generation disabled and reflex enabled. But then, given the genre and gameplay of that game, it doesn't matter so much in the first place. So when it comes to frame generation, perhaps this discussion of where the cutoff frame rate wise is should be left to another video because I don't have infinite time to discuss it here. But I will say hello, Fluffykins. Oh, here comes the audience retention. Oh, thank you, Fluffy. I will say, frame generation has improved with the release of this generation of cards, and in several ways. For a start, Nvidia have rolled out optimized versions of frame generation, which slightly boosts performance and drops VRAM consumption on RTX 4000 series of cards. So that's like a freebie for anybody already using frame generation. But to try and win around more users to this technology, for the RTX 5000 series, there's a new MFG feature, which outputs more than one generated frame between every real one rendered. It can output up to 3 of these fake frames, meaning your frame rates can be quadrupled. So instead of running at 30 FPS, you'll get up to 120, and instead of 60 FPS, 240, and so on. Yes, this still comes with the added latency that frame generation is already known for having, but it doesn't come with any meaningful amount more than that. You're getting 3 generated frames for the price of 1. I didn't think this would change things for me, they are still just generated frames after all, but it's kind of been a game changer. It feels like what frame generation should have been in the first place, because yes, it adds latency, that hasn't changed, and that didn't seem worth it if your frame rate was only being boosted by the technology by 20 to 80%. But when it's being boosted by 100 or 200%, that almost seems worth it. Because that right there means a guaranteed smooth looking result, even under extreme circumstances. You can say goodbye to ever seeing a juddery camera pan or laggy chase scene in a game ever again. And it unlocks a new extreme way of playing games. Cyberpunk 2077 maxed out, for instance, runs at 30 FPS with no DLSS features activated. And it relies on MFG to get it looking more like 90 FPS. Frame rate is suddenly redundant. The output is now assumed to look smooth no matter what. It's just, is it worth the added latency? When I approached it the other way around, it certainly was. I was testing Hogwarts Legacy at 8K because that's the only way you can push this card. There I was with frame generation on, getting about 100 FPS with all of it active. And I was spotting visual artifacts here and there. And I was like, oh cool, I'm discovering the limitations and weaknesses of MFG here. These sorts of artifacts will be too great a compromise for anybody using frame generation to tolerate. That was until I disabled frame generation and the whole image became an unacceptably choppy, motion blurred slideshow mess, and I realised that in this specific circumstance, having MFG enabled was transforming something unplayable into something completely acceptable bar a few localised visual issues. That is a game changer, and is where I think MFG's true strength lies, in making completely unplayable situations playable but with a few insignificant graphical artifacts. Personally, I would choose to change the settings so that it isn't running at 30 FPS in the first place, but if given the choice between running a game at 30 FPS and running the game at 30 FPS with MFG making it look more like 90, then enabling that is a no-brainer, with its benefits vastly outweighing the downsides, and in a way that I never felt fully justified the existence of the original FG implementation. My problem with MFG is less about the multiple frame generation and more about the fact that this is the only card that can run it right now, and it's the card least in need of that technology. MFG has a valuable role in extending the lifespan of older and slower cards, in making emulated titles run smoother, and in hitting fierce 40 or 60 FPS targets in handhelds with minimal power draw. Frame generation has a lot of use cases, but none of that really makes sense with a $2,000 5090. That is, until we get onto Reflex 2, also known as the warp feature, which I prophesized about years ago.
One way that your image could update for your mouse movements separately from the frame generation.
And then Linus covered it as well. So what this warp feature does, it gets the frames your PC makes and then adjusts them for the latest mouse movements before it's displayed on your screen. The result being a more responsive experience at any frame rate. So it's kind of like the opposite of frame generation in a way. But get this, you can combine it with frame generation and get something miraculous. You could have your cake and eat it. Suddenly you can have the increased frame rate and increased responsiveness because every frame sent to your monitor is being adjusted for the latest mouse movements. What an obviously good thing to have. Why haven't I covered it yet? Because they haven't provided a way to test it for this release. There are no games that support it and no little demos I can use. What a shame. This could be the 5000 series' killer feature, and it's not even out yet. I don't know what other reviewers are going to say about this, but I really hope they all cover Reflex 2, what a great thing it could be, and what a shame it doesn't exist yet. I get that something has to come first. Maybe these cards have to exist before games start supporting it. Reflex 2 could change all genres of gaming forever, moving the goalpost of what we expect from frame rates and responsiveness, transforming frame generation from a weird trade-off into a must-have net positive feature, just like the DLSS upscaling component. I know frame generation can work with Reflex 2, and I know it can reduce, maybe not necessarily completely eradicate latency, but maybe bring it down to levels that are acceptable in most use cases. It would be a major step in the right direction. But alas, since it doesn't exist, there's nothing else to say about it right now. What a shame. The 5090's power efficiency is a weird one to me. I expected at least some changes this generation, and yet it seems completely in line with the 4090's power efficiency. It doesn't feel like a step forwards, more like a step sideways, and sometimes even a step backwards. So I approached power efficiency another way, by setting a frame rate target and by seeing how many watts each of these cards took to hit that target. The game being CS2, with me running about Inferno with the frame rate capped to 144, 240, 360, 500 and 1000 FPS. And get this, the 4090 was more efficient in every situation.
Against itself, the 5090 was most efficient at rendering frames at lower frame rate caps, while the 4090 only grew increasingly efficient as the frame rate cap increased. Neither card managed to hit the 500 or 1000 FPS caps consistently, but you can see that the 5090's frame rates peaked slightly higher in terms of FPS. It just also happened to peak significantly higher for power consumption.
Now remember, I'm testing 4K here, so anybody playing this game for real won't even be requiring this much from their graphics cards. CS2 is not exactly a great game to benchmark this tier of cards on. However, I noticed something weird with both of these cards, where they actually were more utilised at 144Hz than they were at 240. Oh, hello again, Fluffy. About time. I think both these cards find CS2 so easy to run that they underclock themselves super low, which makes the GPU utilisation appear higher the lower your frame rate is capped to. I mean, the 5090 was only consuming about 125 watts of power, 124, so it wasn't too bad. Oh, for goodness sake. Anyway, 4090 more efficient than the 5090. My second efficiency test involved hitting FPS targets in Cyberpunk using frame generation. This is the one situation where I could see the 5090 really pulling ahead of the 4090's efficiency, or with it being able to generate more generated frames between every real one. So to hit the same frame rate, it only has to render half the number of real frames a second. And sure enough, it did beat the 4090 in one instance, where it output 144 FPS by consuming 235 watts, versus the 4090's 300 watts to achieve the same thing. But then it's not really the same thing, because the 5090 was only outputting 36 real frames, and then using frame generation 4 times to hit 144 FPS. Whereas the 4090 only has 2 times frame generation, so was having to render 72 in the first place, and thus felt more responsive in use than the 5090's version of the same 144Hz did. She melts my heart. So anyway, there's no other way of putting it. Like for like, the 5090 in my testing was less power efficient than the 4090 was. In conclusion, the RTX 5090 knows its audience. It is the fastest card in the world, power consumption and heat generation be damned. It is ridiculous overkill for today's challenges and has a bunch of features to ready it for tomorrow's. Plus it's had its VRAM boosted from 24 to 32 gigabytes of even faster stuff, because why not? The 5090 is undisputed in every way, but you don't need it. The 4090 was about double the speed of the previous generation. The 5090 is not the same leap up again, but then it doesn't need to be, for it has no competition, nor any real reason to be faster. If you're gaming at 4K, which you're not, this thing is going to be held back by your processor in most situations anyway, at least until your next CPU upgrade. If you're on anything less than 4K, then, Christ man, don't even consider the 5090. Even half the 5090 would be more power than you know what to do with for the foreseeable future. Speaking of which, the 5090 looks to be double the 5080 in every way, price included. So rejoice! For the 5080 should be the logical flagship you should stop your search at, should you be forever getting upsold to cards with more VRAM and performance and features. Either that or the 4090. That, with its 24GB of VRAM and sensible power consumption, I think will remain a very viable high-end card for the foreseeable future. It is still the second most powerful card ever made. I haven't even discussed the neural shaders, the neural faces, the ACE-driven characters, and the other stuff this card supports that's going to transform games in far more meaningful ways than more pixels and frames can ever provide. It doesn't make sense to cover them here since that stuff doesn't exist yet and will gradually come out and will be covered as and when it arrives, on its own merits. And a lot of this will extend the lifespan of older generations of cards as well. The new and more VRAM efficient frame generation technology that's just been released will make it more usable on the 4000 series of cards, and stuff like the neurally compressed textures could potentially cut VRAM requirements to a fraction of their current amounts. Wouldn't that be nice? So there's a lot to look forward to, a lot to look back at, with this card merely being the first bit of new hardware designed to drive it all. But the future does look very bright, and gooey if the Neural Radiance cache has anything to say about it. Just make sure your PSU is up to the task. I'm not a huge fan of these huge fans and the way power consumption is headed. It's awesome they've managed to cool so much power in such a relatively small graphics card. It's an engineering miracle, but also incredibly selfish on the rest of your PC, which has to deal with all that heat that it'll be blasting out at it. Now I get that this card is meant to be the biggest and most powerful, so I give it some leeway there. Of course its requirements are going to be the greatest, but can we please just end this power creep here and say, okay, it's cool, we get it, it's nice that we can get this performance out of a 600 watt card, but wouldn't it be even more awesome if we could achieve even more performance next generation with less power?
Having tested this card so intensely ever since receiving it a few days ago, I've been looking forward to seeing the other reviews of it just as much as you have, to make sure I'm on the right track and to see what other reviewers make of this card. I've had a lot of time to dwell on such things. I remember the same dread just before the 4090 came out, but I needn't have feared because my review of that was awesome. So here's hoping it's the same this time around as well.
I guess I just wish I had friends in the hardware scene to share this stuff with, and to see if I'm on the right track. But alas, it's just me and Fluffykins. I wouldn't be surprised if reviewers underestimated this card. After a few misfires, I tailored my tests to ensure they challenged the 4090 and 5090, but other reviewers featuring other slower cards in their tests are going to struggle to fit all of them in the same benchmark, even when they're armed with an X3D processor, which might lure them into a false sense of security, of safety. Because I don't think the current stack of benchmarks reviewers are using is going to be able to fully utilise this card's potential. You're just going to see this and the 4090 well ahead of everything else on the benchmark charts, and if you're lucky, then the reviewer is going to say something like, clearly we need more demanding tests to fully push this card. I still see people dismissing path tracing and upscaling and AI features, and for those people, the 5090 kind of shuts their argument down, because it also has the raw raster performance that they want. It's just, you don't need it. The 5090 is achieving frame rates at 8K, similar to that of the Geforce 3080 at 4K, and it shows how far we've come. Also in terms of power consumption, it's crept up quite a long way. The only way I was able to challenge this card in existing games was to use settings and resolutions that were totally meaningless and that no one would intentionally game at, even if they did have the power to spare. When I was testing Death Stranding at native 8K, just because I was running into limits at 4K and with DLSS upscaling, I was questioning what it was that I was even testing anymore. Benchmarks used to be about seeing if a game was playable, but I wasn't testing that. I wasn't even testing maximum settings anymore. I'd gone beyond all that and was just seemingly testing for the sake of slowing this card down, just because. That's probably a great way to summarise my thoughts on the 5090. It's not about playing the games anymore, it's about having the absolute most in every way, just because. You'd only consider a card this powerful if you're interested in path tracing, because that's the only thing right now that can challenge a card of this calibre. And that calibre as well. But thanks to DLSS features, oh my god, she's licking my leg. Oh, that's adorable. Don't stop. Oh. But thanks to DLSS features, Even path tracing with these cards is hugely manageable, and the moment I enabled DLSS upscaling in games at 4K, I'd run straight into CPU limits again, so I had to disable it for the sake of pushing these cards. DLSS upscaling has only got better and better. It was already magic a few years ago, and it's only become more magical, what with the new switch to the... Oh my gosh, it's licking me again. And it's only become more magical, what with the move to transformer-based models and stuff like that. I'm really sorry. I'm trying to be professional here. I love that so many improvements to the tech are being rolled out to older generations of RTX cards as well. Owners of the 4090 shouldn't feel too jealous about this new generation of cards. A little bit, but not too much. The frame generation component is still an odd one out in my opinion. It is the one DLSS feature that comes with obvious drawbacks. It's a technology in need of a hero, and that hero could be Reflex 2. Again, I'd like to stress how annoyed I am that this isn't ready to be tested yet, because it could be the most exciting thing about this new generation of cards. What is this card's competition? It's the 4090. That's the only one that even comes close to this card's level of power. The competition isn't offering anything that competes with it. I doubt the next generation of competition will compete with it either. In a way, buying this card now is like time travel. This isn't just eroding the sales of other cards in the 5000 series lineup. It's eroding the sales of future generations of cards and that of competing companies' future generations of cards. It's a bit worrying how much of a lead Nvidia has right now. Anyway, the RTX 5090 knows its market, but it isn't you, nor 99.9% of other people either. I'm not even sure it's for me. I'm going to feel so guilty when I use this later on to play Slay the Spire. It's a flagship product. It's there to show how fast and capable PCs can be in 2025. Every time you're gaming and your PC slows down a bit and you ask, is there any card out there that could handle this challenge? It's right here, and it probably can handle that challenge. But the 5090 being so powerful makes me more excited for the lower tiers of cards, especially with how they've been marketed. So I always thought that the 4000 series cards seem to upsell users towards this 4090 flagship, whereas the pricing for this 5000 generation almost seems to lure gamers towards the opposite, towards the lower options like the 5070 Ti, or maybe even down to the 5070. But the 5080, being half of this in almost every way, is going to be for 1440p what this card is for 4K. That is anywhere from highly capable to utter overkill. And then the 5070 Ti and the 5070, which is less than 1/3 of this card, on paper, I'm still interested to see what 1/3 of this card can do. It's probably still a lot, especially if you capitalize on all of the new DLSS and Reflex features. And I suspect the significance of all these features will only grow as time goes on. Thanks for watching. Like I said, I've done all this myself. It's been fascinating, terrifying, very power consuming. Hit the like button, smash that subscribe button, and tune in for more Fluffykins content. I'm not going to lick you this time. Yeah.